Hello and welcome to Off My Shelves, and in this episode we're going to be looking at Absolute Swamp Thing by Alan Moore Volume 1, and we'll get into it. So yeah, Absolute Swamp Thing by Alan Moore and a range of other creators that are all listed on the front as well. Steve Bissette, John Totleben, Rick Veich, Sean McManus, Dan Day, and loads of others. Now before I get too far into the build of the book, there are two tales to this story. Now there was a first printing of this book which came under the DC Vertigo label. This is the second printing that was under the DC Black label. Now the first printing had some issues with the binding and with the boards bending. I'm thankful to say that all those issues are kind of gone really with this second print. So if you are looking to purchase this right off the bat, try your best to get the DC Black label edition. I'm not sure if the ISBNs are different and you can find it that way, because I've only got this one and I couldn't really find a clear answer online. But either way, the book comes in a slipcase and the book itself is absolutely glorious. I'm sure many of you kind of looking at Swamp Thing Absolute Edition will think exactly the same. I mean, it's got this cloth bound cover which has this velvety type texture. The spine of the book itself has got foiled green writing with DC Black label Volume 1, the authors and artists, but then it's got some stunning beautiful art, and then even on the back the DC Black label logo has these sprouting flowers coming from it, and they actually grow and change when you go through the volume. So the DC logo even adapts and changes to Volume 1, Volume 2, Volume 3, which is an amazing touch. They've done exceptional, and it probably is the best looking book I own, to be honest, and that is a big claim, but I can't think of any other that has the amount going for it that this does in build. The binding is great, it comes with a ribbon bookmark. Yeah, it doesn't let the Absolute editions down at all really. It keeps the standard of those publications very high. I even like the bookend pages. They've got this marbled, painted, inked effect going on the front and back bookend pages. It's just glorious, to be honest. It really is. I could go on all day about how stunning this book is. It's absolute size, so it's a little bit bigger than your Omnibus and a little bit bigger than your library edition. The story itself is a reinvention of Swamp Thing. Now, Swamp Thing as a character was created by some of the most amazing creators ever, Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson. I love Bernie Wrightson's art. The artists Steve Bissette and the various inkers that he brings on, mainly John Totleben, they really kind of have that Bernie Wrightson aesthetic going on. I don't think they went out of their way to impersonate his art style, but I certainly think they learned a lot from him and adapted their styles to kind of have a bit of his, but taking it forward. And the art right off the bat, I will say, is consistent and stunning throughout really. It really is some beautiful artwork, and the panel layout is great as well, because it's got a very stylized over the top panel layout. Like on some pages it's got a bottle of beer that's dripping down the side, you've got arched panels. The range of panel layouts in this volume is crazy, to be honest. Every shape imaginable is kind of worked into the panels really, and yeah, like I say, it is beautiful. The one thing I will say about the art right off the bat that a lot of people I know have complained about is the fact that it's been recoloured. Now, I did read a lot of the original issues of this digitally, and I gotta say I did prefer the original colouring, but the colouring of this didn't put me off in the slightest really. It was fine. Like, everyone's got their preference, but ultimately when you get into it, the colouring is fine. There's nothing wrong with it at all. It just boils down to, I suppose, your personal preference and how much you love the original source material. If you really loved and adored it and were only used to it being in that coloured version, then you're obviously going to be a bit put off by this. But I was quite happy with the adapting colour style of this volume really. But yeah, as I said, to the story, I'm getting distracted by the art before I get under the way of the story. But yeah, the story certainly is a reinvention of Swamp Thing. It starts off with issue 20, which is where Alan Moore jumped on from previous writers and creators, and issue 20 really kind of, as it's called loose ends, and it really is picking off a lot of loose ends of the previous creative team and looking into the aftermath of one of the main antagonists in Swamp Thing's universe. Arcane and his death, and it's basically looking around the aftermath of his death, the battle he had with Swamp Thing in issue 19, and introducing or reintroducing where the cast of characters are at the end of that battle. But it also brings in Colonel Sunderland, who is basically out to capture all these people and to capture Swamp Thing, aka Alec Holland, because he wants the secrets of his abilities. Essentially, he wants to try and figure out how Swamp Thing came about and then turn that into a weapon or a usable force of some kind for him. And so by the end of issue 20, Swamp Thing is killed, shot through the head, and he is taken to General Sunderland's headquarters, where issue 21 begins. And issue 21 really is one of the greatest issues of comics that are out there, really. Like, if you were to ever read a single issue of comic that has everything, I would say issue 21 of Swamp Thing is quite up there, to be fair. It really is. And so yeah, the issue itself is called Anatomy Lesson, and it brings in basically the Floronic Man, as he was called, which is this random character from the DC universe that also has kind of, you know, flower, vegetable properties, let's put it that way. He does an autopsy to try and figure out what makes Swamp Thing, what makes him tick, how they can utilise him in this form. And so he starts cutting him up and figuring out how he works, but nothing makes sense. None of his body makes sense, none of the body parts make sense. And he slowly but surely realises it doesn't make sense for a very good reason. Because previous to issue 21, Alex Holland was a scientist, and he was experimenting with a formula to improve crops and plant life. But he got caught in an explosion and then was cast in the swamp and then came out as the Swamp Thing. But what this book outlines is that Alex Holland didn't turn into Swamp Thing. Alex Holland actually died in that explosion, and then when he went into the swamp, all the chemicals that he was working on and the formula that he was working on went in with him and mutated the plant and swamp life in that pond. And slowly but surely, as his body degenerated and was eaten by all the microscopic organisms in the swamp actually turned into a living being. And a living being that had the consciousness of Alex Holland. Essentially, what this does is it rewrites Swamp Thing mythology totally and utterly, and recreates him not as Alex Holland, but as a creature that had the consciousness and memory of Alex Holland. And it brings in the kind of chemical memory science of leeches and things like that. It's really exceptionally well done. When he wakes up, he wants revenge and kills Sutherland, and just goes off on one totally and goes into himself and separates himself from everything he knows, and then heads to the swamp. And that is really the start of a brand new Swamp Thing. And as the book goes forward, they drop in words like he's an elemental and things like that. When he knows he's not a human turned into a plant, when he knows he's something different, he starts to discover more and more about his powers and abilities, and starts to become more and more of this elemental that people whisper about through this volume, that comes far more into play in the following volumes, really. But the Floronic Man actually kind of tries his hand at taking some of Swamp Thing's powers as well in the first story arc, and that backfires slightly on him, but it certainly pushes Swamp Thing to come back to reality and separate himself from his depression and bring him back to the real world. And then after that, they start opening up and more of Swamp Thing's new abilities, more and more of this world, and start showing him what he can actually do. There's an amazing story arc in here that's all about this kind of autistic school, and because his best friend Abby works in this autistic school, and a demon is summoned to Earth, and there's this crazy monkey looking thing that basically feeds off fear, so it tries to stalk fear of children, and it's basically set up shop in this autistic school. And yeah, it brings in some of Kirby's old characters, the demon, Etrigan, I think you pronounce it. He comes into it, and a lot of other DC characters do pop their head in, so it is part of that DC world. You know, you do see the Justice League in one issue and things like that, so it's not a standalone separate universe, really. Yeah, the places that the book goes is just amazing. They're all kind of really tightly taut story arcs that run either 2 to 3 issues, some one-shot issues, but in general they're really kind of interesting takes on Swamp Thing. And Swamp Thing as a character really is kind of a blank slate when this book starts, because he's no longer Alec Holland. He's kind of reinvented himself, and to a certain degree the book reflects that, because you don't get what he's about, you don't get much of the character right away. It builds and builds and builds, and by the end of the book you kind of understand more of this new incarnation of Swamp Thing. And some of the stories later on, particularly the story arc involving Abby and her husband in it, are just really freaky and very horror centric, and yeah, they're amazing really. And the whole story arcs involving Swamp Thing are really something else, I think, because he travels into so many other places, into hell and other dimensions, and he really starts to redefine himself, as I say, as this kind of elemental being that can travel and control the world in ways that you could never imagine when you start this book off, really. These little concepts that are introduced by Alan Moore are just turned into these gigantic, sprawling storylines that just keep you hooked, really. At the back as well, there are extras, and there is a wonderful kind of essay written by Steve Bissette about the creation of this run, and about the relationship between the artist, the inkers, Alan Moore, everyone, along with a load of other inks and images. And that's basically all I got to say. Certainly it's one of the most beautiful books I've ever seen, and the content of the inside 100% lives up to the beauty of the outside. And what I'm going to be doing now is next month we're going to be looking at volume 2 of the Absolutes, and then in October volume 3 is out, and so hopefully if the release dates stay the same, we're going to be looking at volume 3 in October. And yeah, that's all I got to say about Swamp Thing Volume 1, Absolute Swamp Thing Volume 1 rather. Thank you very much for watching, and I will catch you on the next one.